Hello and welcome. My name is Boris Draluk. I'm the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, which is a co-sponsor of the LAYKA Lens series. This is the third feature in the series of films about contagion and the spread of disease and all of the cultural and political baggage that hangs from that. And I'm joined today by Adler Peckerar, who is the director of Yiddishkayt. We're going to begin our discussion by looking at the background of the film The Light Ahead by Edgar Ulmer. Before I do that, I would like to ask Robbie to maybe say a few words about Yiddishkayt and about the concept of the series.
Sure. So Yiddishkayt is it's our 25th year as a cultural and educational center here based in Los Angeles that is devoted to broadcasting the best of Yiddish culture and cultivating new works of art that relate to the heritage and legacy of Eastern European Jewish life. And this series, the LAYKA Lens series, we started, it has its roots actually a little bit before the pandemic, but since the pandemic has started, we have devoted this whole stretch of this whole series of films to questions about contagion and community, ideas of infection, and how they're and the relations between often between writers, actors, filmmakers, often of Eastern European Jewish origin, and the kind of intercultural relations that play out as a result. So that's part of the thematics of our organization, and they're also sort of playing out in our series here. But I have to say that it's great to be here with a son of Odessa for this film in particular, as a great grandson of people from basically 𝙏𝙝𝙚. I feel like it's a very appropriate combination of the two of us.
Well, 𝙏𝙝𝙚, yeah, 𝙏𝙝𝙚, of course, is the shtetl in which much of the action takes place, and has a wonderful Slavic etymology to it. It's the city of the fools, the town of fools. But I think, Robbie, your native shtetl takes the cake.
It's true. My maternal side of the family comes from a town called 𝙏𝙝𝙚, which is called 𝙏𝙝𝙚 in Ukrainian, which is the town of fetid mud. So it's especially appropriate for our film with the muddy, fetid river of infection.
Yes, and I must say I've never felt so enlightened as when I was watching this film, because Odessa, of course, is the shining light ahead for all of the residents of 𝙏𝙝𝙚, so or those that can take advantage of it. So maybe we can start there and talk a little bit about the imagined geography of the Eastern Jewish lands and how this film takes advantage of that so beautifully in New Jersey.
It's right. It's in New Jersey. It's shot in New Jersey, but the film takes place in this fake town called, or a fictive name of a town called 𝙏𝙝𝙚, which is based on Berditchev, which was an industrial town in the center of the province of Volyn. Voliner Gubernia, we say in Yiddish, and it is where Mendele, or actually that's the pseudonym of the writer Sholem Yankiv Abramovich, lived for about a decade, and including the time in which he wrote Fishke de Kummer, the story on which this film is based. And but he himself is actually, so the geography of the film in Europe sort of spans from the Baltic area almost all the way down to the Black Sea, in the sense that Mendele, or Abramovich, comes from a town called Kopil, which is not that far from Minsk today, and he moved a number of times in his life. First, he moved to Kamenets in Podolia, and then he moved to Berditchev, where he was for another decade, before he moved to Zhytomyr, which is close by, and then he finally ended up in Odessa. So it took him a much longer path to reach the light ahead in Odessa than our main characters did. But he wrote this piece around 1868 in Berditchev, which is the model for the town of 𝙏𝙝𝙚.
That's right. And he died in 1917, basically bracking it off an era of Jewish culture.
Exactly, and you know, he was called by Sholem Aleichem to be the grandfather of Yiddish literature. He becomes part of this triumvirate pantheon, Mendele, the grandfather, Sholem Aleichem, the grandson, and in between, people I think have filled it out with the figure of Yud Lamed Peretz. Very strange sort of genealogy, considering that they're all very close in age to one another. Shlomo
right.
Aleichem was born in 1859, and Peretz is born in 1852, and Mendel is born in 1835. So they're very close in age, although they each die 1 year apart from one another in 1960 and 1950, 1960, and 1917.
And it's interesting, I think, that tells us a lot about the rapid development of Yiddish literature, of Jewish literature in the late part of the 19th century, late part of the 20th, and what a mythos these men built for the Jewish imagination.
Absolutely.
That remained alive into the 1930s and beyond.
Absolutely. And in fact, the dialogue writer for this film, 𝙏𝙝𝙚 𝙏𝙝𝙚, who's another pseudonym of a writer named 𝙏𝙝𝙚 𝙇𝙞𝙜𝙚, he sort of recrafted the mode of Mendele in a certain way by writing fiction based in the United States, but that follows a very similar sort of way of writing about individual, especially people of the marginalized and the poor and the working class, which was something that Mendele in particular really embraced in his writing, following the model of more Western European writers like Dickens, who were contemporaries, who were writing these stories of the poor or the urban poor. And 𝙏𝙝𝙚 𝙏𝙝𝙚 actually lived here in Los Angeles towards the end of his life. He spent the last 25 years of his life. He moved here actually the year that Light Ahead was released. He moved here at the end of 1939. He moved to Los Angeles.
And can you tell us a little bit about the life he found here, the role of Jewish culture in Los Angeles?
Oh, absolutely. It's really 𝙏𝙚 𝙏𝙝𝙚 was very active in the International Workers Order, which was an organization that had split from the Workmen's Circle in the 1920s and formed kind of a left wing of the Workmen's Circle and started its own fraternal organization. He was very involved in education. He was the educational director. He wrote books for pedagogical books, but also was very involved in Yiddish education as well as writing. He wrote children's books, famously a series of books that feature a great left-wing dog named 𝙏𝙗𝙗 and his adventures, and a sequel to that, in fact, featuring another great leftist dog. And so he was very involved in education here, especially even in Los Angeles. He was involved in both the IWO, the International Workers Order, and also in the IKUF, the Kulturverband, the Yiddish Culture Verband, which his colleague here in Los Angeles, also towards the end of his life, one of the founders of that, Kalman Marmor, also lived here in Los Angeles, and the two of them were sort of a kind of a two-person powerhouse of leftist Yiddish writing here, based in LA.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is a great way of starting our discussion, and maybe here we can begin to introduce other panelists who will tell us more about the film.
Great. It's going to be great. I'm very excited to see, because I think what we have here is a panel that also puts together a number of people who were involved in, almost 30 years ago in the creation of this exhibition at MoMA called Bridge of Light. And so I'll duck out while you introduce them, and then I'll come back towards the end.
Fantastic. And what I'll do here is I'll take advantage of this brand spanking new technology called StreamYard to introduce my panelists one by one, and they'll join me in the order of introduction. So first, I'd like to introduce Sharon Rivo, who is the co-founder and executive director of the National Center for Jewish Film and teaches cinema at Brandeis. She is a heroic preservationist and was very much involved in the preservation of this film, the discovery and preservation of this film after years of neglect. Next, I would like to introduce a person with the greatest triple-barreled designation that I've ever seen, drummer, band leader, and film scholar, Sicular, who is the founder of the bands Isle of Klezbos and Metropolitan Klezmer Octet, and is also a great accomplished film scholar who takes her show on the road and has written a great piece to which we'll refer time and again on this film in the context of Ulmer's other films on contagion. So if we can bring Eve in, we'll do so. There some technical difficulties are to be expected. In the meantime, I would like to introduce Jim Hoberman, who, as I always say, needs no introduction, a legendary film critic whose output exceeds my ability to summarize it, and is also the leading light of the LAYKA Lens series these past few months, really instrumental in helping us select films and discuss them thoroughly with you. So thank you, Jim, for joining us. So since Eve isn't here, maybe what we can do is start our discussion with a little bit more information. Well, Sharon has just left too, but she'll be back. So maybe we'll start our discussion with Jim. Jim, could you tell us a little bit about how this film, Ulmer's Light Ahead, fits in the trajectory of the films that we've discussed? So we began with Nosferatu. We continued with Panic in the Streets. And each of those films treats a number of themes that then arise here again in Ulmer's treatment. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how this film treats contagion and what other cultural themes it brings in and links to disease.
Okay, I mean, first I think that of the three films, this is in some way the most heartfelt. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean is that it was a personal project for a number of the people who were involved, and Eve will speak to Ulmer's particular interest in public health and pandemics. And I'll just say parenthetically that his father, I believe, was a victim of the Spanish flu. Javier Paver, who wrote the script, was quite ill when the movie was made, suffering from tuberculosis, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why he relocated to Los Angeles. So they, the pandemic in the movie was something more than a metaphor for them. That said, the movie has a lot on its mind. It's probably, I mean, the other two films we looked at are in some ways political films. I mean,
yes.
Nosferatu maybe not so consciously, but certainly there's a lot of politics there. Panic in the Streets more so. But I think that The Light Ahead, or Yiddishkayt, to give it its Yiddish title, is the one that takes its politics most seriously. And I know that Sharon's going to say some things about it in the context of Yiddish film history, so I won't. Suffice to say that it comes at a what would be the high point and the end, basically, of Yiddish cinema in the late 30s, when Jews were experiencing a tremendous crisis and were full of apprehension.
Yes.
But correctly so. But the Light Ahead is different from other American Yiddish films in that it really focuses on a certain conflict in the Jewish world, and this, basically, this is something that we see now, with the pandemic. I mean, either you trust science, or you feel that this will go away.
God is my healer, as one of the characters says.
God is my healer. Yes, God is my healer, and that is not a character who's presented in a particularly sympathetic or heroic light. In fact, he's one of the bad guys in a sense. So this is a radical position for the movie to take. I mean, it's arguing for science, for progressive social thinking, and against tradition and superstition. And there's no other American Yiddish film which really takes this position. I mean, Uncle Moses is also a political movie, but that has to do with class conflict, in the Jewish community. But this is I think, in a way, a more existential thing. The people who were involved in this movie are also quite political. I mean, Ulmer, I truly do not understand why Ulmer does not have an FBI, given his associations, does not seem to have an FBI file. And the only thing I can think of is that he was like such small potatoes for the FBI, making these foreign language films and so on, that they didn't bother with him, because certainly he had all sorts of associations, including the fact that Boris Moros, the one Soviet spy in Hollywood, produced his Carnegie Hall film, and he still didn't get nobody named him anyway. But he and his wife were leftists. Javier Paver certainly was left wing. I mean, he was a columnist for the Freiheit, which was the Yiddish communist paper, and of course, you know, Mendele was a culture hero among Jewish left wingers and intellectual left wingers. I mean, they saw him as you know, he was anti-clerical and he was extremely critical and so on. So there were all these people, and then the cast. You know, David Opatashvili was a member of the Artef, which was the Jewish workers, the Jewish Yiddish workers theater, and was quite a you know, an amazing example of, you know, a workers culture in the 30s. So he was a very young guy, but he was already in that, the son of a famous Yiddish novelist. Helen Beverly, who his co-star, was kind of a prodigy. I mean, she was, I don't know if she was out of her teens when she made Greenfelder, but she was also a leftist. And in fact, the two of them appeared at a town hall benefit for Bureau Bijan right before the Light Ahead began shooting. You know, Bureau Bijan, the so-called Soviet, you know, homeland for Jews. So I bring this up in that it was a left-wing production, even more than Greenfields, which, you know, has also had a lot of artifics in it. But in a way, this is the opposite, because if you've seen Greenfields, Greenfelder, you know, the countryside is where, you know, Jews can really be themselves, and you can see a kind of crypto, maybe there's a kind of crypto labor Zionist aspect to it. But this is the opposite. I mean, they can't get out of this terrible town fast enough and get to Odessa, you know, the beacon of enlightenment.
That's right.
So the other thing I'll say, and then I'll, you know, I want to bring up that the film did not do well. Did not do well. It's got very good reviews, but audiences, you know, were not crazy about it. And the politics may have had something to do with that. The timing, you know, it came out, you know, like after the war had, you know, the invasion of Poland. Whereas Tevye, which you can see as its kind of mirror image, was a huge success, maybe the most successful Yiddish film of all. And Tevye deals, you know, out front with anti-Semitism. I mean, that's what it's about. And in a very frank way, and the Light Ahead does not. It deals with a conflict within the Jewish world, and you know, it's possible that that's not really what people wanted to be seen. And despite the excellent reviews that it got, I mean, there's another history to why the movie disappeared, but that you know, that's maybe tangential to this discussion.
Yes. Well, one thing I wanted to ask is about the politics of this film, in contrast to the politics of the film that we saw last week, and actually last time, and Nosferatu, is that Nosferatu begins by kind of metamorphosing the Jew into the vampire. Panic in the Streets talks about literal contagion, but marginalizes the victims of contagion, the outcasts, the lower classes. And here we are immersed in the world that is directly affected by the spread of disease, and the struggle that takes place within the marginalized community to understand and deal with this disease. So I think that was a very refreshing change of pace.
Absolutely, and the disease is not personified. If anything, it's personified by the town elders who are angry, you know, blame the village girls for bathing in the polluted river.
Exactly.
They're they profaned the Sabbath, and so God punished them with the I mean, that's, you know, the degree to which the pandemic is personalized. But otherwise, it's not. It's this force, you know, that can only be combated through rational means.
Exactly. Well, that's a great segue to Eve, who is with us for I don't know how long, so I'll take advantage of it.
No, I'm fine. We had some technical difficulties. There's actually a big thunderstorm brewing, and I think it threw off my signal, but it's fine now.
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
So actually, Boris, go ahead. What did you want to ask?
yeah, well, I wanted to ask just about that. We were talking about the rational versus the irrational, and why don't we talk about the context of that battle in the films of Ulmer and Ulmer's personal stance and how it's reflected not just in this film, but in some of the other things that he shot around this time.
Yes. Well, he was such a versatile and not at all mercenary, but on the other hand, he was very much freelancer when there weren't really even independent film world filmmakers. Certainly there was this whole B movie world and the sort of Poverty Row thing that he was part of, but he had an extraordinary range of projects that would come to him. And one of the things that I realized through one particular scene in Fischke der Krümmer and a little bit of knowledge of the wider world of Edgar Ulmer is he made films that he was commissioned by the National Tuberculosis Association. And of course, this is the time before penicillin when there was no real cure for TB. And so they would make these public hygiene films encouraging different kinds of ways to try to preserve one's health, but also, if people could have tests, or go to a sanatorium, things like that. So they were pushing, and Ulmer in particular was hired for 3 of the 6 films he made over the course of, I think, 4 years. They were particularly to communities of color, as we would say now. The first one was the year before The Light Ahead, and that was Let My People Live, which was made specifically for African-American audiences at Tuskegee. Then the same year that they were making Light Ahead, he was sent to be among Mexican Americans and made both a Spanish and an English version of something which in English is called Cloud in the Sky, which refers to kind of the image of the tubercle on an X-ray film is like a little cloud. And then later he made one which is, if anything, the most poignant in terms of COVID in 2020, because it was on the Navajo reservation. And so all 3 of these communities were seen to be some of the most vulnerable to this respiratory scourge. And so they were specifically trying to target, with a kind of, scientific propaganda, really. So Ulmer has, even though Chaber Paver is writing the dialogue, the script, the shape of the script reflects in complete line lifts somewhat, especially from the Mexican-American one. But in each of the tuberculosis films, it's kind of like the opposite power dynamic in terms of the faith leaders, because whether it's in Cloud in the Sky, it's the padre who's really saying, yes, church supports you, but you really must seek out what modern science and doctors can offer. You must go, you must be tested, you must get this diagnosis, and you must do what the doctors tell you. And there are some really, really close parallels in the ways the actual script reads. Earlier in Tuskegee, and then later again in the Navajo film, as in some ways with Fischke, you have also a lot of really wonderful folkloric dance and singing, and a little stereotypical, definitely a kind of, there's a condescension. It's like Ulmer is the great white, savior kind of figure, but still, it's very much shown that Mendele is the one who's trying to help support the people in Glupsk in Foolsville, who are trying to fight for some progressive scientific ways to save themselves, because they see it coming. I mean, there's actually, before the girls are bathing in the river, there's this line about how, it's hot in the summertime. We can't stop the boys. We see them swimming in the river. We should clean out the river. We know there are 100,000 rubles. Why are we not building a hospital and creating conditions for health? But then there's a whole other side of what Ulmer does, which is nonverbal. He has all kinds of disease vectors that are shown through visuals, all kinds of things to do with, like, for instance, the scene with the chicken soup, the Arab Shabbos scene, where there's a whole thing with the camera panning. And, when you have low budget, there are all kinds of ways that you're limited, but he does everything he can with this, these music scores that are classical that mean they're public domain. He doesn't have to pay for them, but he finds the right ways to show a suspense, to show something eerie is happening when all they're doing is dipping in and getting noodles, but they're all dipping into the same, communal soup pot on the eve of not only Shabbos, but the outbreak of this cholera epidemic.
Well,
so
absolutely. So
yeah.
as you're discussing, the roots of some of this imagery and some of these ideas in his commissioned TV films, I was also thinking of The Black Cat, of his horror film, because so many of the scenes in Glupsk that are enveloped by night with these almost abstract images call to mind some of the sets of his horror films, and look forward to his noir, his early noir, like Detour. So that's
another way that he as a low budget director was genius, because he really had done set design more than anything else, early in the silent era, and he continued to be able to do that on a really shoestring budget. One thing I want to say, building on what Jim was mentioning before, though, about the whole idea of that it was radical and daring and the only film that was anti-clerical. Interestingly, Ulmer's fourth, the final Yiddish film he makes, the one following this, which has a lot of similar people, both in terms of producing it and casting, but it's a very different, I would say it's quasi-screwball comedy, and it's really set in Ulmer's own place and time, but a sort of surreal, absurdist one, New York City and the Grand Concourse and the Upper West Side. But he has the same woman who plays 𝙏𝙝𝙚, right, who plays Huddle's best friend, who ends up, dying from going swimming, from getting the cholera. She's playing in this later film, American Matchmaker. She's playing the sort of irreverent sister to this kind of fey leading man. And there's a scene where he's the nice Jewish boy who's giving, alms to these two guys who are, from the local Orthodox charities or whatever. But his sister walks in, she's Elvie, also played by Anna Guskin, and she says, as they're leaving, she's coming in and she says something about, the cowboys with the Schwarze hats or the cowboys with the Goyse hats. So she's making fun of these Orthodox guys, like, oh yeah, the cowboys with the black hats, are they gone yet? So he actually, by that time, in some ways, he has to care even less about the certain ways the traditional audience, because there's really no more Yiddish film distribution in Europe. This is 1940 that they release Amerikaner Schadchen, the year after Fishka.
Well, this is a perfect place to introduce Sharon and to ask her a little bit about the context of Yiddish cinema in the 1930s. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the environment in which Ulmer is working and the light or darkness ahead in front of this film.
Well, there were overall about 100 films that were made, but the heyday of the production, certainly of the sound films, was really 1936 to 1939. And so this is, of course, the time when you've got, the largest speaking Yiddish population is a little bit earlier, the teens, into the 20s, but there's still a pretty vibrant Yiddish speaking population, at least in America, and certainly you've still got access to the European market. Mm-hmm. So you've got, during that period of time, at least 24 films that are made. And what's interesting is in 1939 alone, I found 9 films that were made. And the variety of them is just, quite extraordinary, all the way from, A Brivola de Mammon, which is the Joe Green's film. Mamala's made, sort of 38, released in 39, about the same time. Mirala Efros, Tevye, The Living Orphan, which is a kind of a potboiler from made here, in sort of a basement in New York. But any rate, Muddle the Operator, Mothers of Today, and even Anna Haim, which is made in Poland. So you've got this wide variety of both themes and both from comedy to real tragedy. And of course, then you've got Fishka, from Ulmer. So
actually, I just want to say, Sharon, yeah. I'm sorry. I think the one film that you mentioned that I'm quite sure was a little bit earlier, Living Orphan, was 37, Yiddishkayt. But yeah, 39 was, a lot of times people say, oh my God, it was the end of Yiddish civilization. I say, no, there were many films made in 39, but Living Orphan was earlier.
Well, as we know,
Oh, okay.
1939 was a good year for cinema all around.
Right. You know, absolutely. But this wide variety, though, from the musicals to the, you know, to the Tevye, where he looks, you know, at one point and he says, God, God, where are you, God? I mean, they know what's going on by 1939. You know, the European situation is really pretty awful. And the rise of Hitler and the rise of Nazis, you know, the whole business is, you know, this community is aware of what's going on because they've got, you know, contacts back home. It's not like they're in the dark about this.
Right.
And it seems to me that this film by Ulmer, you know, sort of has the real angst of the despair. You know, when he goes to the window and he talks to God and he says, "Come on, you know, help us, please, God," you know, and it's. At any rate, I think it's a fascinating sort of what I would call the last real chapter of these productions, both, you know, in Europe and, you know, here in the United States, of these, you know, the various kinds of themes and the richness of the culture, which is really comes out in this 1939 sort of, you know, on the cusp of, and unfortunately, you know, by the, you know, just a few days later, it's pretty much gone.
So I have a few more questions for you, but I will say that I also felt that angst and I'll pronounce it English-wise. I also felt that angst, but also the great hope at the end felt to me strained and painful almost. It was an expression of hope that I feel was not necessarily something that he believed. But maybe I'm wrong. In the context of all of the other things that are said, that the Jewish life is just one story that's repeated over and over again of misfortunes and traumas. Well, Jim, you were going to...
No, I was going to say that it is a false note because, of course, you know, when this movie came out, when it was made and when it was released, it was the period of the Hitler-Stalin.
Yeah.
So it was kind of difficult for them to, you know, do what they wanted to do, which ultimately, you know, like Odessa. I mean, it's, you know, they're talking about the Soviet Union on some level.
Yes.
And this you know, incredible betrayal had happened, which basically paralyzed the Jewish left.
Yes.
So I think that's part of it also.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right to note that Odessa represents two things here. It's the same name for two cities. One is the pre-revolutionary light of enlightenment, and one is the post-revolutionary, you know, again, a site in the Soviet Union, which was still a site of Jewish culture, but just a different kind of ideal, slightly different kind of ideal.
I thought if this, you know, I wanted to add something about the subplot, which was tremendously cut back. The version that we saw is about 25 minutes or more, shorter than the original version. And the things that were lost, it's really difficult to know at what point they were lost. I mean, it was after the first release, but some things attracted some negative attention, at least from the New York State Department of Education, which effectively censored all foreign language movies. I mean, Yiddish films were considered to be foreign films, even when they were made in New Jersey, in the United States, and they were subject to a different kind of attention. And I've often wondered why this is, because Fishka had its world premiere in Detroit, which is very unusual for for Yiddish talk. And I wonder if that wasn't because they didn't have some problems with New York State. The thing that they had the problems with, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the wedding was cut out, which is, you know, I feel badly about, since that's really we should talk about the wedding. It's really in some respects, the climax of the film. It's all the stuff about the Galagansa chickens. I mean, there's much more of that, and it's drawn from, you know, one of Mendele's most famous diatribes, the tax on kosher meat. And the thing is that had a lot of relevance still for Jewish audiences, because not to go into great detail, there was in New York there was what was called the Kosher Meat Trust. I mean, in other words, there was aspects of the rabbinate charged extra for having, you know, meat declared kosher. and the butchers had to pay this, and then they had to pass it on to the customers, and there was a rebellion. There was actually a riot, at least one, like a housewife's riot on the Lower East Side in the early part of the 20th century. But Ben Katcher has a great description of this actually in his book on dairy restaurants, which I recommend to everybody. Should have that in their house. So this is going on also, and this is like the other thing. In addition to the irrationality of the community leaders with all this money, not wanting to like set up a hospital, you have this other thing going on where this poor schlemiel who's being cheated because he didn't get his he got his chicken in some other town, which obviously wasn't paying into the local trust.
That's right.
And so that got in its way, that's just as critical, even though it's more specialized. So a lot of that stuff got cut out.
Absolutely. And speaking of cuts of meat and otherwise, we have an excellent question in the comments from Tomek, and maybe Claire can bring that up. I'm wondering about the subtitling and translation. It appears that quite a lot is left untranslated. What is the reason for that?
Okay, the only materials that we were able to find was a print. There were actually 2 prints, but they already had subtitles on them, so that we were trapped in trying to kind of tuck in some extra subtitles, because in the days, in the 30s when they were making the films, they did put English subtitles on them even at that point, but most of the audience, they figured, spoke Yiddish, so they were just sort of summary kinds of titles rather than a more literal translation. So that it was one of those, unfortunately, that we were never able to find new clean materials. Actually, we're in the middle right now of doing a major restoration of Yidel with his fiddle, because we finally found a clean print that it took us a long time to acquire, and we've just done a new translation. So for the first time, that film will really have, the ability to really have a terrific translation, for that. But that's the reason.
Excellent. And another question that we don't have to bring up, but Chris Hoffman asks, what's the name of the book Jim recommended? And it's The Dairy Restaurant by Ben Katcher. Oh, yeah. And Jim's review is in book form, so a delight. Good. So why don't we talk about that wedding? Why don't we cut to the chase? Who would like to begin the conversation about the wedding? It's an interesting ritual. Can anyone introduce it for us? Maybe Sharon, maybe since you're still on screen, you could say just a few words about it.
I mean, other than, traditionally, I guess it goes way back. I just knew about the references back into, the sort of the epidemics of the 1870s, but I gather it was even before that, that this superstition of, hello.
Oh,
yeah,
we can
you're there.
Can you hear me? All right,
yeah.
Because I just kind of lost you guys. Let me just see if I can get you back. The tradition of marrying the poorest people in town, in the graveyard in order to, ward off this terrible epidemic. But somebody else knows of the earlier ones. But I gather that for real. They were in Lublin, and there are references to a number of weddings that took place. For exactly this reason. And as I think I told you before, that my grandmother who lived with us, who'd come from Eastern Europe, she was extremely superstitious. And so, I can understand how when people are in real poverty, they need something to look forward to. And so, these kinds of myths that maybe to get them out of, terrible situations where they didn't have the medication, they didn't have the knowledge or whatever to be able to escape these kinds of things. People really did believe in these kinds of these tales.
Absolutely, and it goes back to 1830. One way to think about these rituals, of course, is a form of scapegoating. The Jews, who were so often scapegoated for the spread of disease as a group, were then turned on the outcasts among themselves to ward off that accusation. And but of course, as you say, Sharon, it's also a way of of dealing with uncertainty, of dealing with the uncontrollable, of trying to wrest some agency as best they could from a situation in which they seem to lack all agency.
And then speaking of people, who are trying to gain their agency, I mean, one of the points I think here is that, yes, it's a superstition and it's very kind of, it's this central thing that people remember, especially in 2020, that this is this 𝙏𝙝𝙚 𝙼𝙚 or 𝙼𝙝𝙚. But there's also the dignity of these two people that's so much the emphasis for Ulmer in so many of his films, that, these people who are the downtrodden, nevertheless, they have their self-respect. And so the couple, the choleria bride and groom, who don't want to be stigmatized like that at first, Huddle is refusing to go along with it, and they have to keep upping the ante with the dowry. But then, they work it out with Mendele himself that they'll be, it's kind of also interesting because in Yiddishkayt and Fiedel, of course, there's this whole thing about the bride escaping from the wrong marriage and leaving in the middle of the dancing. And in this movie, they work it out in advance so that actually the lovers really are in love, and they manage to have it both ways. That's the way that they actually have their nest egg to get started, not as beggars in Odessa, but actually taking, the sort of corrupt from the superstition and then turning it around so that they can go to the place of enlightenment and get ahead of the game.
Absolutely, it's making the best of the circumstances, and you're quite right about the nobility of these characters. That we first meet Fishke when he is tramping along the road because he's hurt that he has been called what he essentially is by his loved one, and he doesn't want to accept that. That's not how he wants to be referred to, and that's not how he wants to be defined, especially by the person who loves him. And then we meet Hodel, who refuses to go begging, who refuses to use her eyesight, lack of eyesight, as a means of getting money. It's really remarkable how Ulmer very quickly introduces them as noble characters. I was also delighted to learn at the end that Hodel wasn't born blind, and so she may see again.
Right.
So it's a great.
There's a light of hope.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I wanted to say when you were talking about this whole idea of whether it was a false note that they were ending on. The translation of the title, I mean, on the one hand, in Yiddish, it's known also not only as Fishke der Krummer, like Fishke the Lame, but also some people call it die Kliatsche, which is the mare or the nag, the old horse, which is another Mendele famous literary work. But to call it the light ahead in some ways refers, maybe as the Ulmers often did, it was kind of an in reference for them. Yes. So many of the TB films have these kind of dogmatic, positive, didactic titles, like Another to Conquer is the name of the one about, the Navajo elder who eventually realizes he does have to listen, when the diagnosis tells him to go to the sanatorium. Or so there's Let My People Live. There's, all these other really sort of
which has its Jewish tones too. Let My People Live.
Well, and that one refers consciously, Old Testament, I would say, because they do have the sort of Negro spirituals that they're singing. Sure. Although that film ends with Western Enlightenment triumphing because he actually goes with Handel's Messiah as the way to show that they've really triumphed.
I wanted to point out that with the plague weddings, and I should say parenthetically that that there was one in Tel Aviv or outside of Tel Aviv during the pandemic that got a lot of attention in the Jewish press. So that it hasn't disappeared, but fittingly for a Jewish, there are two ways to look at it, at least, and there's the way that that it is a form of scapegoating, that it may in fact be connected to the Gentile superstitions and accusations that Jews spread the plague. So there is that sense of it, and frankly, I'm not sure how Mendele, what his take on it was. But then there's the other thing that it's very positive. Oh, it's a wedding, it's these are bad times. People need to be cheered up, and it's also we're sort of taking care of it. We're making a match, like and people should celebrate. It gives them a chance to celebrate. And this is why I think that it's to me it's such a shame that we don't see the full aspect of it. And also parenthetically, this turns up in one other movie, the last real shtetl movie that was made in the Soviet Union, The Border, Granitsa, in 1935, has a plague wedding too, which and it's quite ambiguous in that, and that's another movie showing about the Jews living in the Stone Age and in Poland, looking across the border to the Lenin Kolkhots and so on. But the fact that the movie ends with its wedding really puts it in a kind of special place among Yiddish films, because virtually all Yiddish films have weddings. Mm-hmm. And why do they have weddings? They have weddings because the wedding was like the source of shtetl entertainment, and everything came out of it: stand-up comedy, music, big feasts, and so on. It's so significant to village and impoverished Jews, and so the movies just naturally incorporated. But there was never another movie that had a wedding quite like this one.
But it doesn't actually end there, because it ends that they've escaped.
Yes.
That actually they're on the path away from Gloops.
But it's the big scene.
And the thing is, I think in a way, because Ulmer actually refers in his writings to that he looks down on Joseph Green. He feels like Joe Green, Yiddishkayt Fiedel, that wedding. He feels like there are a lot of
vice versa, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I'm sure they all had cuts.
Yeah, right.
And Sidon with the lowest budget ever.
That's right.
It's like the competing to the bottom, the race to the budget bottom. But on the other hand, I would say that Ulmer has seen lots of Yiddish theater and knows that a wedding is this kind of integral, central celebration. But I really think he's taking it in the other direction. And by the way, I'll add, since it's low budget, that unlike the Navajo dances, unlike the Tuskegee choir, unlike even the sort of cheesy Mexican hat dance, literally, which are all performed by the real musicians. In this one, the klezmer musicians are faking it. Yeah. And he's got 78s playing. What's that? Yeah, which, it wouldn't have been that expensive, actually, to.
Yes.
No. But I'm curious now what the in the book 𝙏𝙝𝙚 𝙠𝙝𝙚, is there a plague wedding, and what is Mendel's take on it? Because in a way this movie softens him quite a bit. Mm-hmm. I mean, his descriptions of Glubsk are go way beyond what we see in this movie. So maybe Robbie, as the Mendel expert, yes, can fill us in on that.
Well, if we can invite Robbie, he can pop in anytime. Here he comes.
Yeah.
Oh,
there you are. Meanwhile, I'm having expressionism right outside my window. If you see a big lightning flash, it's not Ulmer. It's now.
Where are you?
Now I'm in Westchester.
Oh.
So there's a storm system.
Well, I say Ulmer's always now. Robbie.
Well, we hope Ariana, his daughter is right now watching and with us. That would be great. She's in the film, of course. She was 2 years old, and she's in LA now, but she was in this movie. Robbie, are you there? Are you on mic?
Yes,
okay.
I'm here. It's funny. I should have reread 𝙏𝙝𝙚 𝙠𝙝𝙚 before we did this. I actually don't remember the ending. I have it actually right here on the shelf behind me, and I will take a look at it. But I don't remember how that part ends. Maybe someone in our audience will remember. It's been a while. But,
it would be interesting if it was just introduced into the film, because also Opetashu's father wrote a story about a plague wedding too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just shared.
I think
that's right. We just shared that. We just shared that the new translation by Jeff Chandler on our Facebook page. But we can actually share that too. The Chasanaf and Beiselim. We have the wedding at a cemetery. Or Magefa Chasana that takes place in the cemetery that's described absolutely by David Apatashu's father, Joseph Apatashu, who wrote that story. So it's unclear how those thematics got worked in, but it's really interesting that those were clearly prevalent, and I think potentially worked into the later script. But I'll take a look at the story to try to remember what happened.
One way or another, it's very fitting for Ulmer's aesthetic, and it's also symbolically very rich because, of course, the lovers are reborn. They have to die a death before they can escape into the light. So before we move on, I would like to mention that Eve's article on Ulmer's Cinema of Contagion is actually on the Yiddishkayt website, so you can all find it there, prominently displayed on the front page.
And it has links actually to all of the tuberculosis films, as well as the eerie Erev Shabbos chicken soup scene in Yiddishkayt. And more.
Right.
There's more. And there's actually some other stuff that ties in. We don't have time now, but it ties into both Ulmer's last Yiddish film in terms of not so much contagion as much as whether the whole idea of whether homosexuality is some kind of hereditary thing. Even though it's a comedy, it does dwell on what I call the celluloid closet of Yiddish film. But also he made an earlier film to do with syphilis, and there's even a kind of reference, a kind of in-joke actually to do with that. Oh, thunder, lightning. Anyway, onward.
And if Yiddishkayt can also share a link, if they can find it, to an article on the Cholera Wedding. It's called The Cholera Wedding and Its Meaning for Our Time by Natan Meyer, and that's on the LA Review of Books website. So we might be able to share that link. Well, I think it's a great time to open the floor for 1 or 2 questions. We have just about 5 to 6 minutes left. So if there are any questions among the viewers, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll pose them.
Apparently, there's something from Carolyn about Chaver Paver and Zalman.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Let's take a look.
Yeah, Carolyn comments about the connections between Fischke and Chaver Paver's work about Zalman der Schuster, or Zalman the Cobbler, which is an LA-based story that actually describes a real person who lived here in Los Angeles, whose real name is Harry Goldfarb, who had a shoe repair shop across from the South Pasadena commuter rail today, the Gold Line here, and it describes sort of the path of various people, especially working class people in Los Angeles, and there are definitely echoes of, especially considering there's a tubercular theme that comes up in there too, in the stories about people heading to sanatoria in this area that come up in the Zalman der Schuster book, and it's a really interesting link between the ways that that he continued to the legacy of this writing about everyday working class Jews and elevating them to this kind of mythic kind of perspective in his writing, in the same way that he takes the Mendele, I think, and reworks it here. Yeah. And
another question, follow up from Caroline, is can you tell us a little bit more about the personal relationships of Chaver Paver and Ulmer and Opatashku?
Well, I know that Chaver Paver worked on some other movies. He worked on Joseph Green's The Purimspieler. But this was a really important project to him. He had written a play based on this several years before, and he couldn't get it produced because there was a rival production. Joseph Buloff had his own version of a Mendele play, and so he couldn't get that produced. And then the Freiheit had a contest for plays, and he entered basically the script for this movie, and he won. And so that's how it may have come to Ulmer's attention. But he knew David Opatashku quite well, because he was his Yiddish tutor. And he said that he only would tutor the children of Yiddish writers. And so he's the one who recommended, David Opatashku to Ulmer. So, I think that they were part of a wider circle. And the thing is that Ulmer was not really familiar with Yiddish culture or Yiddish theater until he came to New York. And when he came to New York, he got right into it, because he recognized, it was a tremendous theater, and in some respects far ahead of what was being done in the American English language theater. I mean, the Artef was a fantastic ensemble. So this is my way of saying that these people all, there was a certain common milieu that they were part of.
But he also, I mean, on the one hand, he knew the Schildkraut family, and they kind of adopted him because he was a semi-orphan. And when he came to New York, I guess it was a huge production with like 50 people, and he went back and forth between New York and Europe and LA. But he also picks up on these different shtiklach, like there's the where has my Thursday gone? I think that was an old shtick, and the whole bringing in the Galaganska Hon with a stutterer. It's like just as much as having a wedding was a trope. Sadly, having stammering was like a kind of, and even a different actor has a whole stuttering routine in the next Ulmer Yiddish film. And yet, it sort of brings up that even this guy, he has a serious point to make, but he's getting in his own way, Yes. But still, that was a theater thing, and I know there are many recordings, that are like the comedy. It's interesting because he gets all elements of Yiddish film, and even with American Matchmaker, it had been on stage with the same leading actor, who was also like what they called an eccentric dancer. It looked like his limbs were made of rubber, but Ulmer brings it in more that he's like a kind of the side of him that was glamour, that was a kind of Fred Astaire of Yiddish screen. But the thing is, I feel as though it is kind of a pastiche, and in a way it fills the screen time, even though he has a serious message and a trajectory that he's working out with Haber Paver. There's still a real pastiche sense to me in terms of all the different levels of kind of shund elements, but that bring up the serious things. And maybe that's to also have levity, to allow the viewer to really keep reminding them that this Galaganska thing isn't just a joke. The guy is really protesting something important.
No, it's sugarcoating and pleases the audience who have a certain horizon of expectations.
Yes, but also, I mean, I think, Boris, one of the interesting things, I think, after this week of political conventioning, there's an interesting connection between the idea of people with disfluent speech, not letting that define them, which we just heard, I think, last week pretty clearly. And there's this idea about people who are marginalized, people who are living with disabilities, and the way that society marginalizes them, but the heroism or their absolute Menschlichkeit, their human decency shines through. And even though these kind of elite forces who would seek to marginalize even further or disregard these people on the margins or mock them, the basic decency of these people to argue for themselves and for a better world is actually one of the things that I think is being elevated in the film, even while it's playing with certain types of historical, both theatrical and literary tropes of disability in Yiddish and Yiddish literature in particular.
And in fact, if you watch American Matchmaker, the guy who's got the disfluence of speech there, he's really the brains behind the Matchmaker Trust. He's really one who holds up the number that the guy should bid in the bargaining, with the boss. But, the guy tells him, shut up, let me do the talking. But then he's really the one who's calling the shots.
Well, this is the first in the series, a film of true transcendence. It's really a film with a light ahead. Thank you all for joining me. And this could not have gone better, I feel. One thing we didn't manage to say, and maybe Sharon can just say a few words about it, is where is this film available for those who would like to see it? And can you tell us a little bit about the extant prints of some of these Yiddish classics?
Yes, well, this one, we actually have 35mm prints of Fischke, but it's also available, on DVD, and you can, if you're a library, you can buy digital site licensing. If you're, for a congregation, we're doing a lot of that these days. National Center for Jewish Film, it's just www.jewishfilm.org. We're actually physically on the campus of Brandeis University. We're not Brandeis, but we've been here since our founding in 1976. And there's about 40 other Yiddish feature films, not only the 9 or 10 that were made in 1939, but all the way back to some silence, as well as our latest restoration actually is a 1919 Broken Barriers, which is based on Shalom Aleichem, but it's actually English, and it was made here in the States. It's a 100-year-old film that we've just restored and played at Lincoln Center right before all of this kind of crashed. So please be in touch. Just go to National Center for Jewish Film or jewishfilm.org, and you can find us easily to get various...
And if you
I believe,
if you receive the link to the film through Yiddishkayt, then that's still available for another week.
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. Well,
so thank you all for organizing this. It was enlightening as well as I think a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I feel like having a wedding.
Well, almost all of the films have weddings, as you know, Yves, so that, as you've mentioned, so there needs to be something to celebrate in these days.
Absolutely.
Well, soon may we be able to gather safely again and play music live. That would be great.
Yeah.
That would be nice, and have some good food as well.
Absolutely.
Between the food and the music, yes. Anyway, everybody should be safe and well.
Yes, yes.
Live is in.
Thank you, guys.
Great to see you all.